Power rules the skies, thunder answers its name, and Mount Olympus watches in silence. But the king who commands it all has a life hidden behind the storm. Zeus sits on his throne as judge, ruler, and protector of order, yet his footsteps keep returning to secret chambers, forbidden encounters, and faces he swore no one would ever see. Every lightning strike that splits the clouds carries a question. What happens when the most powerful god alive cannot control his own choices? From disguises and transformations to betrayals carved into myth, the truth behind Zeus is not found in temples or prayers, but in the shadows between his public reign and private actions. In the vast and ever-expanding world of Greek mythology, there lies a realm filled with secrets, hidden lives, and divine beings whose actions can both shape and shatter the world. Among these gods, none is as powerful, as enigmatic, or as flawed as Zeus. His story is not merely one of grandeur and glory, but one woven with complexity, contradictions, and deep moral ambiguity. Zeus is, after all, the king of the gods, the ruler of the heavens, the one who wields lightning and thunder as instruments of fate. Yet, beneath this regal exterior lies a web of relationships, decisions, and secret affairs that paint a picture of a deity who is far from perfect, and perhaps far from the divine ideal that we might imagine. What makes Zeus truly fascinating and even unsettling is the dichotomy between his public persona and his private life. On the surface, he is the archetype of divine power, supreme, unchallenged, and eternal. His decisions shape the course of both gods and mortals alike, and his influence extends beyond the boundaries of the heavens into every corner of the world below. But what if the gods themselves were not as perfect as they seem? What if the divine beings we venerate and worship are not immune to the same desires, mistakes, and flaws that we mere mortals struggle with every day? Zeus, for all his might, is not a mere figure of awe and admiration. He is a character rife with contradictions, someone whose actions continuously blur the line between right and wrong, good and evil, light and darkness. His story is not simply the tale of a ruler's ascent to power, but one of struggle, temptation, and the internal battle between control and chaos. In fact, it is these very contradictions that make Zeus so interesting. While he possesses the power to create and destroy, to bless or curse, it is his personal affairs, his deeply human-like flaws, that reveal the true complexity of his character. The very nature of the divine is called into question when we examine Zeus, not through the lens of his mighty rule, but through the eyes of those who are caught in his webs of manipulation, desire, and deceit. When we speak of Zeus' secret affairs, we are not merely delving into the romantic exploits of a god who sought fleeting pleasures with mortal and immortal beings alike. No, we are looking into the darker corners of his character, where power is wielded not just as a tool for ruling, but as a weapon for seduction and control. Each of Zeus' affairs represents not only a conquest, but a pattern of behavior, a signature of manipulation, and a demonstration of his ability to dominate not just through his divine authority, but through his overwhelming charm, beauty, and intellect. These affairs were not accidental. They were purposeful, orchestrated by a mind that understood the subtleties of persuasion and the intricacies of power. Take, for instance, his first affair with the Titaness Métis, which would eventually lead to the birth of Athena. The very act of Zeus swallowing Métis in an attempt to prevent her from bearing a son who might overthrow him demonstrates a deep-seated fear and paranoia. He wasn't just acting out of desire, but from a place of insecurity, fearful that his own children, like his father Cronus, might one day challenge his rule. This, too, is part of Zeus' hidden nature, his vulnerability. For all his power, Zeus is never free from fear or the anxiety that those around him might seek to dethrone him, even his own offspring. This is the first glimpse into the complex psyche of the king of the gods, a being who, despite his control over the cosmos, is deeply insecure and afraid of losing everything he has. This fear, however, is not the only driving force behind Zeus' actions. His unrelenting pursuit of beauty, particularly in the form of mortal women, is another integral part of his character. While many might view the gods as transcendent and above such earthly desires, Zeus is, in this regard, remarkably human. His affairs are not mere lapses in judgment, but acts of divine hubris. His desire to possess, to control, and to manipulate is a reflection of his position as the highest deity, the one whose will shapes the world. In a way, Zeus' constant pursuit of women, whether they be mortal or divine, serves as a reminder of the fragile balance between power and corruption. Yet, these affairs are not without their consequences. The very act of Zeus seducing or raping mortal women, sometimes without their consent, sets off a chain of events that reverberates through both the mortal and divine worlds. The birth of Heracles, for example, comes at the expense of Alcmene's suffering. Alcmene is tricked into sleeping with Zeus, believing him to be her husband. This deception leads to the birth of a hero who will become both a symbol of strength and a reflection of the twisted nature of his father's desires. Heracles' story is in many ways a tragic one, as his great strength is countered by the immense suffering that he endures, much of it stemming from the acts of his divine father. Zeus' actions are not confined to the mortal realm. However, his relations with other gods are equally fraught with tension and complexity. Hera, his wife, embodies the emotional weight of Zeus' infidelities. She is not just the goddess of marriage and childbirth, but the goddess of vengeance. When Zeus strays, she strikes back with fury that matches his own. This ongoing conflict between husband and wife is emblematic of the fragile nature of divine relationships. While Zeus may hold ultimate power, Hera's wrath is not to be underestimated. In fact, it is Hera's response to Zeus' infidelities that ultimately shapes much of the mythology surrounding their marriage. Through Hera, we see the emotional toll that Zeus' affairs take, not only on the women involved, but on those closest to him. This sets up a powerful tension between the gods, a tension that transcends mere jealousy and becomes a matter of divine retribution. As we begin to explore the nature of Zeus' secretive affairs, it becomes clear that these myths are more than just stories of divine seduction or infidelity. They are reflections of deeper truths about power, control, and the consequences of unchecked desire. Each affair, each act of manipulation, and each moment of betrayal serves as a microcosm of the greater forces at work in the cosmos. The gods may be immortal, but they are not infallible. Their actions have consequences, not just for themselves, but for all those who are caught in their spheres of influence. Zeus, for all his might, is ultimately a figure of profound tragedy. His story is one of triumph and failure, power and vulnerability, control and chaos. As the king of the gods, he represents the ideal of ultimate power, yet his actions, driven by insecurity, desire, and fear, reveal the fragility of that power. He is a god who can shape the world with a single thought, yet is unable to escape the same emotional entanglements that plague mortals. In many ways, Zeus is as much a prisoner of his own desires as the mortals whose lives he so casually manipulates. In the end, the story of Zeus' secret affairs is not merely about the king of the gods' romantic entanglements. It is a story about the nature of power itself, the way it corrupts, the way it isolates, and the way it ultimately fails to protect those who wield it. The more we learn about Zeus, the more we realize that his story is not just one of divine glory, but one of divine tragedy, filled with hidden desires, secret betrayals, and the consequences that ripple across both the heavens and the earth. And as we delve deeper into the myths, we will begin to see that the gods, for all their grandeur, are not immune to the same flaws that define the human experience. Zeus, the god of the sky, the ruler of Mount Olympus, the mighty king of the gods in ancient Greek mythology, is a figure whose legacy is as awe-inspiring as it is complicated. To understand Zeus, we must first appreciate the profound power and the grandeur that defined him, for his ascension to the throne of the gods was no mere accident. He was not born into power like a traditional monarch, nor did he simply inherit his divine rule. Zeus' rise was marked by violence, betrayal, and the ruthless overthrow of his own father, Cronus, the previous king of the gods. In many ways, Zeus' story embodies the very essence of what it means to wield power, to possess authority that is both absolute and fragile, and how that power can come at a great personal cost. Zeus' path to power was not a simple one, nor was it free from dark and turbulent moments. The tale begins with his birth, a prophecy that his father Cronus would be overthrown by one of his own children. Fearing the prophecy, Cronus, who had already swallowed all of his children, did the same with Zeus upon his birth. Yet, through the cunning and bravery of his mother, Rhea, Zeus was secretly saved and hidden away, growing strong in the care of the nymphs. It is this early deception, this first moment of defiance against his father, that begins to shape the character of Zeus, a god who would grow to challenge authority, to defy fate, and to emerge victorious in the end. As Zeus matured, he learned of his father's tyranny and the dark fate that awaited the world under Cronus' rule. But Zeus was not one to cower in fear. His spirit was one of defiance, of revolution, of pushing back against the very forces that sought to suppress him. With the help of his siblings, whom he freed from Cronus' stomach, Zeus waged a mighty war, the Titanomachy, against Cronus and the Titans, a battle that would determine the fate of the cosmos itself. The conflict was a grand and epic struggle, one that tore the heavens and the earth asunder, shaking the very foundations of existence. In the end, Zeus emerged victorious, casting down his father and the other Titans, taking control of Mount Olympus, and assuming the throne as the supreme ruler of the gods. This victory was monumental, not only because Zeus defeated the forces of chaos, but because it marked the beginning of an era of divine rule and cosmic order. With his victory, Zeus brought stability to the world, an order that had been fractured by the rebellion of the Titans and the preceding rule of his father, Cronus. The gods now had a king, and that king was Zeus, who would sit upon the throne of Olympus, a position of unrivaled power. From this lofty perch, Zeus controlled the heavens, the earth, and all that dwelled within them. He governed the storms, the lightning, the winds, and the skies. His word was law, and his power was absolute. He could command the heavens to rage with fury or to calm in an instant. The very forces of nature bent to his will, and the cosmos itself danced to the rhythm of his commands. Yet, despite this boundless power, Zeus was not immune to the complexities of rule. His ascent to power had cost him dearly. The battle with the Titans was not without its sacrifices, and the act of overthrow of his father left a trail of bloodshed and turmoil. Zeus had to make difficult decisions, to choose sides in the war, and to accept the consequences of his actions. In the aftermath, the gods were left to rebuild, and Zeus, now the undisputed ruler, was tasked with maintaining the delicate balance of the universe. This burden, this responsibility, would shape his character for all time. Zeus was no longer just a god of power. He was a god of governance, of rule, and of responsibility. His role was not just to command the heavens, but to ensure that the divine order remained intact. In the early days of his reign, Zeus was a god of justice. He was a protector of law and order, the divine enforcer who upheld the moral and natural laws of the universe. His reign brought peace and stability to a world that had been torn apart by war and conflict. The gods who followed him were loyal, for they saw in him a ruler who embodied the virtues of fairness, strength, and wisdom. He rewarded those who were faithful to him and punished those who defied him. His justice was absolute, and his judgment was final. There was no questioning Zeus' decisions, for his wisdom was considered infallible. He was a god who governed the heavens, the earth, and the seas, and under his rule, the divine order was secure. However, as with all rulers, the power of Zeus would eventually be tested. Over time, the weight of his responsibilities began to take a toll on him. Though his rule was unquestioned, the demands of leadership weighed heavily upon him. The constant need to make decisions, to balance the needs of the gods and the mortals, and to maintain the cosmic order began to wear on Zeus. He found himself surrounded by those who would challenge his authority, those who sought to exploit his power for their own gain, and those who resented the very nature of his reign. The complexities of power began to reveal themselves in ways that Zeus could not have foreseen. One of the greatest tests of Zeus' reign came not from external enemies, but from within his own family. As the king of the gods, Zeus was surrounded by powerful figures who were not content to simply serve him. His siblings, his consorts, and his children all had their own ambitions, their own desires, and their own claims to power. Zeus had to navigate the complex relationships within his divine family, all the while maintaining the image of an unassailable ruler. His marriage to Hera, the queen of the gods, was itself a union fraught with tension, for Hera was not simply a passive consort. She was a powerful goddess in her own right, and the two of them often found themselves at odds over matters of power, justice, and influence. Zeus' infidelities were another challenge to his rule. As the king of the gods, he was expected to set an example of divine morality, yet his numerous affairs with both mortal and immortal women were a glaring contradiction to this ideal. These affairs, which ranged from consensual unions to outright acts of deception and coercion, cast a shadow over Zeus' reign. While he might have been the ruler of the heavens, he was not above the temptations of power, and his actions often revealed the more human aspects of his nature. He was not the infallible god that many believed him to be, but rather a ruler whose decisions were influenced by desire, pride, and an insatiable need for control. The story of Zeus is one of constant tension between his godly virtues and his deeply flawed humanity. His reign was marked by a moment of greatness, where he stood as the embodiment of divine justice, wisdom, and power. But it was also marred by a moment of weakness, where his desires and emotions led him astray. In many ways, Zeus' greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his desire for control. As king of the gods, he was the ultimate authority in the universe, but in his personal life, he often struggled to maintain that same control. His relationships, his affairs, and his decisions often led to chaos and turmoil, both among the gods and the mortals. Despite his flaws, however, Zeus remained the most powerful figure in Greek mythology. His control over the natural world, his ability to shape fate itself, and his unyielding authority made him a figure who could not be challenged. Yet, the very nature of his power was a paradox. Immense yet fragile, unassailable yet constantly tested. The legacy of Zeus is not just one of power and glory, but one of complexity and contradiction. He is a god whose rise to power was both heroic and tragic, whose reign was marked by both triumph and failure. Zeus embodies the dual nature of power itself, the ability to shape the world and the inability to escape the consequences of one's own actions. In the end, Zeus is not just a god of the sky or the ruler of Olympus. He is a figure who embodies the struggle for power, the complexities of leadership, and the eternal tension between divine perfection and human imperfection. His story is one of immense grandeur, but also a profound vulnerability. For all his might, Zeus was never free from the very desires and weaknesses that define the mortal condition. His reign, though seemingly eternal, was marked by the same struggles, uncertainties, and challenges that every ruler faces. In this way, Zeus remains not just a symbol of divine rule, but a reflection of the human experience itself, full of contradictions, complexities, and moments of brilliance and failure. Greek mythology, often considered the cornerstone of Western storytelling, is a realm brimming with divine beings who possess extraordinary powers, yet whose actions and emotions often mirror those of mortals. These gods and goddesses are far from infallible. They are driven by passions, desires, and flaws that shape their interactions with one another and with humans. The world they inhabit is not one of perfect order or eternal peace, but rather one teeming with chaos, rivalry, and moral ambiguity. And among all these gods, Zeus, the king of the gods, occupies a particularly intriguing position, a figure of immense power whose personal life, marked by secrecy, manipulation, and moral contradictions, stands in stark contrast to his public persona as the ruler of the heavens. Zeus, as the supreme deity of the Greek pantheon, embodies the concept of power in its most absolute form. He governs the sky, the thunder, the lightning, and the winds. His word is law. His will is unquestioned, and his control over the natural world is absolute. To the ancient Greeks, Zeus was not merely a god among others, but the very force that kept the universe in balance. His role as the king of the gods made him the ultimate authority, not only among the Olympian gods, but also over all that lived in the mortal realm below. He was a god who was revered and feared in equal measure, his name spoken in awe and his presence felt in every storm, every flash of lightning, and every rumble of thunder. Yet, despite all this power, the world that Zeus inhabited was not one of calm order. It was a world in constant flux, where the gods, despite their immortality and grandeur, were continually at odds with one another, driven by desires, ambitions, and jealousies that often spilled over into chaos. The beauty and danger of Greek mythology lie in the way the gods are portrayed, not as perfect beings, but as complex, multidimensional characters whose flaws and virtues are intricately woven together. Their relationships are fraught with tension, betrayal, and conflict, and even the most powerful gods, like Zeus, are not immune to the consequences of their actions. As the king of the gods, Zeus is constantly navigating the turbulent waters of divine politics, attempting to maintain control over his realm, while dealing with the many challenges that arise from his interactions with other gods and mortals alike. One of the most striking features of Zeus' character is the dichotomy between his public image as a powerful, just ruler and the darker, more secretive side of his nature. On the surface, Zeus is the embodiment of justice, fairness, and order. He is the god who ensures that the natural world functions according to divine law, and his actions are often framed as being in the service of maintaining cosmic balance. His authority is unchallenged, and he is seen as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. Yet, beneath this regal exterior, there lies a far more complicated figure, one whose personal life is marked by selfish desires, moral ambiguity, and a constant pursuit of power and pleasure. Zeus' many affairs, particularly those with mortal women, reveal the hidden side of his character. While he is revered as the ruler of the gods, he is not immune to the same desires that plague humans. His numerous liaisons, often involving deception or manipulation, demonstrate that even the most powerful gods are susceptible to their own passions. For example, his affair with Leda, in which he transformed into a swan to seduce her, is one of the most famous and disturbing stories in Greek mythology. The very idea that a god would resort to such a form of deception, transforming into an animal to fulfill his desires, speaks to a deeper, more troubling aspect of Zeus' nature. It is not merely the act of infidelity that is disturbing, but the manipulation and coercion that are involved. Zeus' power as a god gives him the ability to shape reality itself, and he uses this power to control the lives of those around him, bending them to his will. This pattern of behavior is not limited to his relationships with mortal women. Zeus' interactions with other gods, particularly his wife Hera, are similarly marked by tension and manipulation. Hera, the queen of the gods, is often depicted as a figure of jealousy and vengeance, particularly in response to Zeus' numerous infidelities. Her anger towards her husband is not just a reflection of personal betrayal, but also a manifestation of the power dynamics at play within the divine hierarchy. Hera, though powerful in her own right, is often portrayed as being in competition with Zeus, both in terms of authority and influence. Her attempts to punish Zeus' lovers and children are not just acts of revenge, but also of asserting her own power within the divine family. At the heart of this conflict between Zeus and Hera is the complex nature of their relationship. On one hand, they are married, bound by the sacred institution of divine union. On the other hand, their relationship is one of constant power struggle. Zeus' affairs, his numerous infidelities, and his disregard for Hera's feelings create an emotional distance between them that is never truly bridged. In many ways, their relationship symbolizes the inherent tension between the masculine and feminine forces in Greek mythology. Zeus, as a dominant figure, represents the archetype of masculine power, unyielding, dominant, and assertive. Hera, in contrast, represents a feminine principle of nurturing, protection, and loyalty, yet also the rage and vengeance that come with betrayal. The dynamic between them is one of balance and imbalance, a constant push and pull between two forces that can never fully harmonize. This contrast is mirrored in the wider divine world, where the gods' personal desires often clash with their responsibilities as deities. The gods may possess great power, but they are not immune to the same flaws that affect mortals. Their relationships are often driven by passion, jealousy, and rivalry, and their actions, though sometimes justified in their eyes, often have unintended consequences. For instance, Zeus' relationship with Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, resulted in the birth of Persephone, whose abduction by Hades led to the creation of the seasons. In this case, Zeus' desire for control and his pursuit of power have direct consequences on the mortal realm, altering the very fabric of nature itself. These stories highlight the paradox of the heart of Greek mythology. While the gods are powerful and immortal, they are also deeply flawed, subject to the same passions and failings as the mortals they govern. The gods' power, though immense, does not shield them from the emotional complexities that define their relationships. In fact, it is often their power that exacerbates these complexities, as their ability to shape the world around them allows them to manipulate, control, and deceive in ways that mortals cannot. The world of Greek mythology is a world of constant flux, where the gods, despite their eternal nature, are subject to the same forces that shape the mortal realm. It is a world where the boundaries between divine and human desires are often blurred, and where the consequences of divine actions ripple outward, affecting everything from the heavens to the earth. Zeus, as the king of the gods, occupies a central role in this world of divine tension. His actions, both noble and questionable, shape the fate of both gods and mortals alike. But it is his personal life, marked by secret affairs, manipulations, and betrayals, that reveals the true complexity of his character. As we move deeper into the myths of Zeus, It becomes clear that his power is not simply a tool for enforcing divine order, but also a reflection of the very forces that define human nature. His reign, though marked by victories and triumphs, is also a reflection of the darker side of divinity. Zeus' constant pursuit of pleasure, control, and dominance reveals the fragility of power, and his actions show that even the most powerful gods are not immune to the complexities of desire, jealousy, and emotional turmoil. Zeus' world is one of constant tension between power and weakness, justice and manipulation, love and betrayal. His actions, while often viewed as a dictator or godly ruler, are also the actions of a being who is deeply human in his desires and flaws. His reign is one of absolute authority, but it is also a reign marked by moral ambiguity and personal contradiction. In many ways, Zeus' story is not just a story of a god, but the story of power itself, a power that is both immense and fragile, righteous and flawed, eternal and transient. Through Zeus, we see the complexities of leadership, the burden of divine rule, an eternal struggle between desire and duty that defines not just the gods, but all of existence itself. Zeus, the king of the gods, was a figure whose power stretched beyond the heavens. He wielded authority over the sky, the storms, and the very forces of nature. But alongside his supreme control over the cosmos, Zeus was also defined by his insatiable desires. Among the most intriguing and controversial aspects of his character were his numerous affairs, many of which were secretive and involved manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. One of the earliest and most significant of these affairs was with Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. The story of this affair not only reveals the complexity of Zeus' character, but also introduces us to the darker side of his influence and the consequences of his desires. Nemesis was a powerful and mysterious figure in Greek mythology, often depicted as a personification of divine vengeance. She was a goddess who ensured that those who committed acts of hubris, excessive pride, or arrogance would face consequences. In the vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, Nemesis represented the balance between fortune and misfortune, acting as a reminder that no one, not even the gods themselves, was beyond the reach of justice. This divine role of retribution made Nemesis a figure of significant power and influence. She was not to be trifled with, for her judgment was impartial and swift. Yet, despite her status as a goddess of vengeance, Nemesis would find herself caught in the web of Zeus' manipulations, a victim of his desire to exert control and power over all that he encountered. The story of Zeus' affair with Nemesis is one of seduction, control, and ultimately, the consequences of Zeus' actions. According to some versions of myth, Zeus was struck by Nemesis' beauty and, perhaps more importantly, by the challenge she posed to him. Nemesis was not a goddess who could be easily swayed or manipulated. She was known for her dignity, her sense of justice, and her unyielding nature. Yet Zeus, ever the seducer, decided that he would have her, regardless of her divine authority. In some accounts, Zeus pursued Nemesis with relentless determination, using his godly charm and charisma to convince her to submit to him. But Nemesis, knowing full well the nature of Zeus' desires, resisted him, not wanting to fall prey to his manipulation. In response, Zeus resorted to an act of transformation, changing himself into a form that could deceive her. Zeus transformed into a swan, a creature often associated with beauty and grace, attempting to charm Nemesis and win her over to the guise of innocence. The swan, in its delicate elegance, was a far cry from the powerful and imposing figure Zeus that was known to all the gods. Yet, beneath this innocent exterior lay the same manipulative and calculating mind that had conquered the heavens. In his swan form, Zeus approached Nemesis, and in an act of divine deception, he succeeded in seducing her. What followed was the birth of a child, a daughter named Helena, who would later become one of the most famous figures in Greek mythology. The affair between Zeus and Nemesis is a tragic example of the lengths to which Zeus would go to satisfy his desires. It highlights his tendency to use his power not just for the benefit of the gods or the maintenance of cosmic order, but to satisfy his own lust and need for control. Zeus, the ruler of the gods, was not a passive figure in this affair. He actively pursued Nemesis, using his divine powers of transformation and manipulation to bend her to his will. This story serves as a stark reminder that even the most powerful beings are susceptible to their own desires, and that these desires often come at the expense of others. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this affair is the nature of the child born from it. Helena, the The birth of Helena would later lead to the Trojan War, one of the most devastating conflicts in Greek mythology. The gods' actions, particularly those of Zeus, had far-reaching consequences that rippled to the mortal world. In the case of Helena, Zeus' pursuit of her mother, Nemesis, set in motion a chain of events that would result in the death and destruction of countless mortals. The myth of Helena and the Trojan War is a prime example of how the actions of the gods, even those taken for personal reasons or out of selfish desire, could have far-reaching and devastating consequences for humanity. The affair between Zeus and Nemesis is not just a story about love or lust. It is a story about power, manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked desires. Zeus' ability to shape the world around him through his divine powers allowed him to manipulate those around him, including Nemesis. He was a god who, though bound by the constraints of fate, could bend the natural order to suit his needs. His pursuit of Nemesis, though initially a personal desire, ultimately became an act of divine control. Through this affair, Zeus demonstrated the darker aspects of his nature, his need to dominate, to control, and to bend the will of others to his own desires. It is a reminder that power, even in the hands of the gods, is not without its darker side. The myth of Zeus and Nemesis also raises important questions about the nature of consent and agency in Greek mythology. The gods, with their immense power, are often portrayed as beings who impose their will on others, using their divine abilities to shape the world and the lives of mortals. In the case of Zeus and Nemesis, we see how Zeus' desires override the autonomy of the goddess. Nemesis, though powerful in her own right, is unable to escape the influence of Zeus, who uses his godly powers to manipulate her into submission. This dynamic, which appears throughout many of Zeus' affairs, highlights the problematic nature of divine power in Greek mythology. While the gods are often depicted as paragons of power and wisdom, they are also shown to be deeply flawed beings whose actions can be selfish, harmful, and morally ambiguous. The legacy of Zeus' affair with Nemesis is far-reaching, both within the realm of Greek mythology and beyond. The birth of Helena, a child conceived in deceit and manipulation, serves as a reminder that the actions of the gods, no matter how seemingly inconsequential, can have profound effects on the mortal world. Helena, who would later become the most beautiful woman in the world, will be the cause of the Trojan War, a conflict that would destroy cities, end lives, and change the course of history. In this way, Zeus' personal desires set the stage for one of the most famous and devastating wars in mythology. The consequences of his actions, though personal and self-serving, had far-reaching repercussions that reverberated through both the divine and mortal realms. Zeus' affair with Nemesis, like so many of his other relationships, reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of his character. On one hand, he is the king of the gods, the ruler of the heavens and protector of divine order. On the other hand, he is a being driven by his own desires, capable of using his divine powers for personal gain and manipulation. His ability to shape the world around him, to transform himself into various forms, and to bend others to his will, speaks to the absolute nature of his power. Yet, despite his immense authority, Zeus is not immune to the darker side of his nature, the side that seeks control, satisfaction, and domination. His affair with Nemesis is a perfect example of how this darker side of Zeus, his desire for power and manipulation, is a driving force behind many of the events in Greek mythology. Ultimately, the affair between Zeus and Nemesis serves as a cautionary tale. It is a story of power, manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked desires. Zeus, despite his vast power, is not above the forces of passion and temptation. His actions, though seemingly justified by his divine status, lead to disastrous consequences for both gods and mortals alike. The birth of Helena, the catalyst of the Trojan War, is a reminder that the gods, for all their grandeur, are still subject to the same flaws and weaknesses that define human nature. Zeus, the mighty king of the gods, whose control over the heavens, the earth, and the very elements was unrivaled, remains one of the most complex and fascinating figures in Greek mythology. His life was marked by a series of powerful acts that shaped the world and the lives of both gods and mortals. However, while his divine reign was characterized by wisdom, order, and justice, it was also profoundly influenced by his personal desires, many of which led him to engage in deceitful acts, manipulation, and infidelity. One of the most notable and controversial affairs in Zeus' extensive list of liaisons was with Io, a mortal woman whose life will be irrevocably altered by her interaction with the great god. This story, like many in Greek mythology, is filled with twists and turns, and it highlights Zeus' ability to change not only the course of events, but the very nature of those around him. Io, a beautiful mortal woman, was the daughter of the river god Inachus. She was admired for her grace and beauty, but she was not a goddess. In fact, she was a mortal, bound by the rules of human existence. Her story begins as one of innocence, but would soon take a darker turn when Zeus set his sights on her. His desire for her was intense, and as was often the case with the king of the gods, his attraction led to a series of actions that would not only change Io's life, but set in motion a tragic sequence of events. Zeus' desire for Io was not simply a fleeting moment of infatuation. It was part of a larger pattern in which he often pursued mortal women, using his charm, his power, and sometimes his divine abilities to get what he wanted. However, Io was not an ordinary mortal. She had a purity and an innocence that stood in contrast to the manipulative nature of the god pursuing her. When Zeus first saw her, he was struck by her beauty and immediately sought to seduce her. But Io, unlike many others who had fallen victim to Zeus' advances, was not easily swayed. As with many of Zeus' affairs, he could not accept rejection. The nature of his power meant that he often manipulated situations to suit his desires, and this was no exception with Io. Fearing that his wife Hera would discover his infidelity, Zeus took drastic measures to hide his actions. He transformed Io into a beautiful white heifer, hoping to conceal her from Hera's prying eyes. In doing so, Zeus thought he could shield Io from the wrath of his jealous wife and escape the consequences of his actions. However, this act of transformation was not merely a way to hide Io from Hera. It was also an indication of the extent to which Zeus was willing to manipulate not only the lives of mortals, but the very nature of reality itself. While Zeus may have believed that transforming Io into a heifer would protect her, it ultimately only served to deepen her suffering. Hera, ever vigilant and aware of Zeus' proclivities, quickly discovered his deceit. In retaliation, Hera demanded that Zeus give her the transformed Io as a gift. Zeus, unable to refuse his wife, reluctantly complied, and Io was taken away by Hera's servant Argus, the hundred-eyed giant, who was charged with watching over the helpless heifer. Despite the transformation, Io remained conscious and aware of the cruel twist her life had taken. The innocence of her mortal existence was shattered, and she was subjected to constant torment. Argus, with his many eyes, kept a close watch on Io, never allowing her to escape or find peace. The torment was relentless, and Io's suffering grew with each passing day. Her life, once filled with promise and beauty, was now one of constant fear and longing. The heifer, now a prisoner of Hera's jealousy, was unable to return to her human form, and Io was left trapped in a state of despair, unable to escape her fate. It was during this time that Io's suffering took on a symbolic role in Greek mythology. Her plight represented not only the power of the gods, but the vulnerability of mortals who became caught in the crossfire of divine conflict. However, Zeus was not entirely indifferent to Io's suffering. Despite his previous manipulations, he could not bear to see her in such torment. After consulting with the gods, Zeus sent the messenger god Hermes to rescue Io. Hermes, known for his cunning and speed, was tasked with defeating Argus and freeing Io from her prison. With his characteristic wit and resourcefulness, Hermes approached Argus and lulled him into a deep sleep by playing the music of his pipes. Once Argus had fallen asleep, Hermes swiftly killed him, thereby freeing Io from her torment. But the story of Io did not end there. Although she was freed from the physical constraint of Argus, the emotional and psychological scars of her experience remained. Io, now returned to her true form as a mortal woman, wandered the earth in a state of anguish. Her suffering was far from over, for Hera, in her wrath, sent a tormenting gadfly to pursue Io, stinging her relentlessly as she wandered across the lands. The gadfly, sent by Hera, chased Io through lands that stretched from Greece to Egypt, where she eventually came to rest by the Nile River. It was here that Io's journey took on a more symbolic nature. The trials she faced were not simply about Zeus' infidelity or Hera's jealousy. They were about the mortal condition itself. Io, like many other figures in Greek mythology, became a symbol of suffering and endurance, her trials representing the challenges that mortals often face when caught between the whims of the gods. Her story echoed the human experience of being subjected to forces beyond one's control, of enduring suffering at the hands of those who wielded power, without regard for consequences. Yet, through this journey of suffering, Io's story also became one of transformation. When Io finally arrived in Egypt, her torment was lifted, and she was restored to her true form as a mortal woman. She was eventually reconciled with Zeus, who, in his desire to make amends for the suffering he had caused, granted her immortality. Zeus transformed her into a goddess, allowing her to live on as a symbol of divine grace. In many versions of myth, Io went on to have a child with Zeus, a son named Epiphus, who would go on to have his own role in Greek mythology. Io's journey, marked by suffering, endurance, and eventual transformation, became a story of redemption, one that exemplified the complexity of the gods and the interplay between suffering and divine intervention. The myth of Io, like many Greek myths, is a story of power, manipulation, and the consequences of divine actions. Zeus' role in this story, though initially one of seduction and deceit, evolves as the narrative progresses. His initial act of transformation, designed to conceal his actions from Hera, ultimately leads to a series of events that demonstrate the darker side of divine power. While Zeus may have intended to protect Io from Hera's wrath, the suffering he caused her was immeasurable. The transformation of Io into a heifer, the kidnapping by Argus, and the relentless pursuit by the gadfly all serve as reminders of the unintended consequences that arise when gods use their power without consideration for those they affect. At the same time, the myth of Io highlights the role of the gods in shaping the mortal world. Io, though immortal, was caught in a divine struggle between Zeus and Hera, two powerful figures whose personal conflicts had far-reaching consequences. Her suffering serves as a metaphor for the ways in which mortals are often at the mercy of the gods, their fates determined by the whims of beings who exist on a completely different level of power. However, it is also a story of resilience and hope, as Io eventually finds peace and redemption. Her transformation into a goddess represents the possibility of healing and the power of divine intervention to bring about a change in fate. Zeus' involvement in the myth of Io, like his involvement in many other myths, is a reminder of the complexities of divine power. His actions were not always just or fair, but they were always impactful. The gods, despite their immortality and power, were not immune to the consequences of their actions. Zeus' manipulations, though often driven by personal desires, left a lasting imprint on the mortal world. The story of Io is a testament to this, a narrative that explores the tensions between power and responsibility, between desire and consequence, and between the gods and mortals. Ultimately, it is a myth that reminds us of the complexities of the divine, and the price that must sometimes be paid when power is abused. Zeus, the king of the gods, whose presence and power cast shadows over all that existed, was as notorious for his affairs as he was for his rule over the heavens. Throughout Greek mythology, his actions, decisions, and the consequences that followed often shaped the world in ways that reflected his personal desires and the conflicts they sparked among the gods. Among the many figures who were caught in the web of Zeus' divine pursuit was a mortal woman Alcmene, whose life would be irrevocably altered by the powerful god's desire. Alcmene's story is one of the most dramatic and compelling tales in Greek mythology, illustrating the intricate balance between power, fate, and the god's influence over mortal lives. It is a tale filled with deception, divine manipulation, and an unexpected twist of destiny that would echo through generations. Alcmene was a mortal woman of great beauty and virtue, the daughter of a Theban general Electrian. Her life, like that of many mortals in Greek mythology, was shaped by the gods, though not always by her own choosing. She was betrothed to Amphitryon, a noble hero and warrior, and their life together promised to be one of happiness and prosperity. But Zeus, whose desires often led him to seek out mortal women, had other plans. Alcmene's beauty and virtue caught the eye of Zeus, and as with many of his previous liaisons, he became determined to make her his own. Yet, unlike many of his other affairs, the story of Zeus and Alcmene was not one of straightforward seduction. It was instead a tale of divine trickery, a plan orchestrated by Zeus that would blur the lines between truth and deception. Zeus, ever the manipulator, realized that in order to have Alcmene, he would need to be cunning. Knowing that Alcmene was already betrothed to Amphitryon, He devised a scheme that would allow him to pursue his desires without facing the wrath of the mortal world. Zeus transformed himself into Amphitryon, Alcmene's husband-to-be, and took his place in their home. Alcmene, unsuspecting and trusting, believed that her husband had returned early from battle and welcomed him with open arms. For 3 days and nights, Zeus, disguised as Amphitryon, shared her bed, and the two lived as husband and wife. To Alcmene, it seemed as though nothing had changed. She was in the arms of the man she loved, and the world was as it should be. However, this was no ordinary union. This was a divine deception, a scheme crafted by Zeus to manipulate the circumstances in his favor. What Alcmene did not know was that the man she believed to be her husband was, in fact, the god Zeus himself. Her perception of reality was completely altered, and she was unknowingly partaking in a union that would have enormous consequences, not only for her, but for the world at large. The encounter between Alcmene and Zeus, though physically the same as any other union, was something far beyond the ordinary. The child that would be conceived from this act would not be a mere mortal, but a hero whose name would echo through the halls of legend for centuries. The consequences of Zeus' actions, however, did not end with the act of deception. When the real Amphitryon returned, Alcmene was confused and disoriented. She was confronted with the strange and unexplainable situation in which she had shared her bed with 2 different versions of the same man. She could not understand how this was possible. Her confusion deepened when she discovered that she was pregnant. The child she carried was not merely the result of a normal union, but the child of a god. This pregnancy would lead to the birth of Heracles, one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology, whose strength, courage, and deeds would surpass even the gods themselves. Heracles, or Hercules, as he would later be known in Roman mythology, was destined for greatness, and his birth was a direct result of Zeus' manipulations. But Alcmene, caught in the whirlwind of divine trickery, had no idea that her child was to be the product of such extraordinary circumstances. She would soon learn that her life, as well as the life of her son, would be anything but ordinary. Hera, Zeus' wife, was soon to discover the truth behind the birth of Heracles, and her jealousy and rage would fuel a long and bitter enmity toward a child who was born from Zeus' infidelity. Hera's wrath would serve as a constant force in Heracles' life, creating obstacles and trials that would shape his journey and define his destiny. The birth of Heracles was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a series of events that would ripple throughout Greek mythology. Hera, furious that her husband had once again betrayed her, sought to punish the child who was a product of Zeus' deception. She sent 2 serpents to kill the infant Heracles, but even in his infancy, the future hero displayed his immense strength. Heracles, with his godlike abilities, strangled the serpents with his bare hands, a sign of the great feats that he would accomplish later in life. Yet, despite this early victory, the life of Heracles was to be filled with hardship and struggle, much of it instigated by the vengeful actions of Hera, who could not forgive Zeus for his unfaithfulness. The myth of Zeus and Alcmene, though centered around a personal affair, is a story that speaks to larger themes of divine influence, fate, and the consequences of the gods' actions. Zeus, in his pursuit of mortal women, often disrupted the lives of those he encountered, leaving behind a trail of chaos and transformation. In the case of Alcmene, his desire to manipulate events led to the birth of Heracles, a figure whose destiny was forever intertwined with the whims of the gods. The very nature of Heracles' birth, the divine intervention that brought him into the world, meant that he would always be caught in the cosmic struggle between the god and mortals, a hero whose feats would be shaped by the actions of Zeus and Hera. Zeus' affair with Alcmene also serves as a reflection of his larger role as a god who wields immense power, but whose actions often have unintended consequences. While his ability to shape the world and alter the lives of mortals is unquestioned, the legacy of his affairs reveals the darker side of his nature. His desire to dominate, to control, and possess often led to actions that disrupted the natural order and created conflict among the gods. In the case of Alcmene, the consequences of Zeus' actions were far-reaching, affecting not only the lives of those involved, but the world of mortals as well. Heracles, born from this divine deception, would go on to become a symbol of human strength and resilience, but his journey was shaped by the gods' manipulation, betrayal, and rivalry. The myth of Zeus and Alcmene is a story of divine interference in the mortal realm, a narrative that showcases the power of the gods to shape human destiny. It is a tale of deception and trickery, of love and betrayal, and of the indelible impact that the gods have on the lives of mortals. Through Zeus' actions, the lines between the divine and the mortal world become blurred, as the affairs of the gods create ripples that affect generations to come. The birth of Heracles is a testament to the enduring legacy of the gods and their influence over the world, a legacy that would continue to shape the lives of both mortals and immortals for centuries to come. In the end, the story of Zeus and Alcmene serves as a reminder of the complex and often contradictory nature of the gods in Greek mythology. Zeus, despite his position as the ruler of the gods, was not above the temptations and desires that led him to manipulate the lives of those around him. His affair with Alcmene is just one example of how his power was often wielded not for the greater good, but for personal satisfaction and control. And yet, even in his pursuit of pleasure and power, Zeus' actions set in motion events that would define the course of mythological history. The birth of Heracles, a child conceived through deception, became the catalyst for a series of heroic deeds, challenges, and trials that would resonate throughout the ages. The myth of Zeus and Alcmene, like many others in Greek mythology, is a reflection of the eternal struggle between the gods and the mortals, between desire and consequence, and between fate and free will. Zeus, the supreme ruler of the gods, was no stranger to infidelity, and his numerous affairs became legendary across the ancient world. One of the most intriguing and significant of these relationships was his affair with the nymph Danae. The story of Danae is not just another tale of Zeus' romantic escapades. It is a myth that reveals deep themes of fate, divine intervention, and the intersection of human desires with divine will. Danae's life was drastically altered by her interaction with Zeus, and the consequences of their affair would set the stage for the birth of one of Greek mythology's most famous heroes, Perseus. Danae, the daughter of King Acrisius of Argos, had an ordinary life in the eyes of most mortals. Her father, however, was tormented by a prophecy that stated his daughter's son would one day kill him. As a result, Acrisius went to extreme lengths to protect himself from this fate. His fear of the prophecy led him to imprison Danae in a bronze tower, far away from any potential suitors, believing that by keeping her isolated, he could prevent the birth of the child who was destined to bring about his death. However, even the might of a king could not control the will of the gods, and the very actions he took to protect himself would inadvertently set in motion the chain of events that led to his demise. In the tower, Danae's life was one of confinement and isolation, but it was also one of beauty and grace. She was untouched by the world, surrounded by nothing but her thoughts and the divine gaze that the gods often cast upon mortals. It was in this tower, amidst the silence and stillness, that Zeus first saw Danae. As with many of his other affairs, Zeus was not content with the boundaries set by mortals. His desire for Danae was not just a passing fancy. It was a desire rooted in the very fabric of fate itself. In Greek mythology, the gods often acted in ways that were not only selfish, but deeply intertwined with the destinies of those they interacted with, and Zeus was no exception. Zeus, ever the master of disguise, found a way to visit Danae despite the physical barriers that kept her isolated. In one of his most famous acts of divine seduction, Zeus transformed himself into a shower of gold, a shimmering and powerful stream that poured into Danae's chamber. This golden rain was not just a symbolic gesture, but a physical manifestation of Zeus' overwhelming power and his ability to transcend the limitations of both mortal space and time. The golden shower flowed to the tower's walls and reached Danae, who, struck by the beauty and awe of the event, was left powerless to resist. This transformation was symbolic on multiple levels. The golden rain, unlike any other natural phenomenon, was divine in its essence. It was not simply a romantic gesture, but a reminder of Zeus' absolute power and his ability to control the world in ways that mortals could never fully comprehend. The shower of gold, pouring from the heavens, represented both the fertility and the danger of divine intervention. In this golden rain, Danae was both a victim and a participant, unable to stop the events that were unfolding. The nature of her conception was not one of choice, but one of divine will. Zeus' desire for her was not simply an affair born of passion, but an act that intertwined their fates forever. Danae's life was irrevocably changed in that moment, as she became the mother of a child who would later become one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. Danae's experience with Zeus, however, was far from an isolated event. Her father, King Acrisius, upon learning of her pregnancy, was filled with terror and fury. His worst fears had come to pass, and now his daughter was carrying the very child who was prophesied to kill him. In a panic, Acrisius ordered that Danae and her newborn child be cast into the sea in a wooden chest, hoping that the gods would take care of them and that he would be spared from the prophecy. The actions of Acrisius, driven by his desperation, only served to further entwine the fates of the gods and mortals. What he did not realize, however, was that in his attempt to control the prophecy, he was setting in motion the very events that would lead to his downfall. The chest, carrying Danae and her son, Perseus, was cast adrift on the sea, and it eventually washed up on the shores of the island of Seriphos. Here, they were discovered by the kind fisherman Dictys, who took them in and cared for them. Although Danae had been abandoned by her father, the gods had not abandoned her. Her life, though marked by suffering and isolation, had been touched by divine intervention, and the consequences of her relationship with Zeus would follow her, as they would follow her son, Perseus. The child she bore would be the hero who would ultimately fulfill the prophecy that her father had so desperately tried to prevent. Perseus, born of the golden rain, was destined for greatness. He was not simply a mortal child, but a hero whose existence was linked to the divine world. From the moment of his conception, his fate was intertwined with the gods, and his story would be shaped by their will. As Perseus grew, he became a strong and courageous young man, unaware of the great feats he was destined to accomplish. However, Zeus, as the father of Perseus, would continue to play a role in his life, guiding him through challenges that lay ahead. The prophecy that Acrisius had feared came to fruition when Perseus, as a young man, was tasked with a dangerous mission by King Polydectes of Seriphos. Polydectes, who had fallen in love with Danae, sought to rid himself of Perseus in order to marry her. He devised a scheme to send Perseus on an impossible quest, to slay the Gorgon Medusa, a creature whose gaze could turn anyone to stone. Perseus, determined to prove himself, accepted the challenge, unaware of the divine aid that would be provided to him. Zeus, watching over his son, sent Perseus the tools he needed to succeed. Perseus was given a magical shield from Athena, winged sandals from Hermes, and a sword capable of cutting to Medusa's petrifying gaze. These gifts, divine in origin, were instrumental in Perseus' success. With the help of the gods, he succeeded in slaying Medusa, and from her blood, the hero would later create a series of legendary deeds. The slaying of Medusa was not only a heroic act, but also a manifestation of Zeus' role in guiding and shaping the destiny of the sun. The gods' involvement in Perseus' journey was a reminder that even mortal heroes could not escape the influence of the divine world. Despite the divine gifts and the favor of the gods, Perseus' story was not one of easy victory. His journey was filled with trials and tribulations, each of which tested his courage and strength. One of the most significant challenges Perseus faced was the rescue of Andromeda, a princess who was chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster. Perseus, after slaying the monster, rescued Andromeda and made her his wife. This event was not just another heroic act. It was also a fulfillment of Zeus' will. Through Perseus' actions, the gods continued to shape the course of events, and his actions resonated throughout the mortal world. Eventually, the prophecy that Acrisius had feared came true. Perseus, having returned to Seriphos, accidentally killed his grandfather, King Acrisius, with a discus during a competition. The very prophecy that had driven Acrisius to abandon his daughter and grandchild had come to fruition. In a tragic twist of fate, the gods had allowed Perseus to fulfill the prophecy, despite the desperate actions of his grandfather to prevent it. The story of Danae, Zeus, and Perseus is a tale of divine manipulation, fate, and the inevitable fulfillment of prophecies. Zeus' affair with Danae was not just an act of passion, but an event that set in motion a series of events that would alter the course of Greek mythology. From the golden rain to the birth of Perseus and the tragic fulfillment of the prophecy, this myth highlights the ways in which the gods and mortals are bound by fate. The divine intervention of Zeus in Danae's life was not merely an act of desire, but an act of fate that would forever change the world. The legacy of Danae and her son Perseus would resonate through the ages, a reminder of the power of the gods and the indomitable force of destiny. Zeus, the king of the gods, was known for his immense power and his ability to shape both the heavens and the earth with his will. However, alongside his control over the universe, Zeus also had a reputation for indulging in numerous affairs, many of which led to complex, often tragic consequences for both mortals and immortals. One of the most intriguing and painful stories of Zeus' romantic pursuits was his affair with Leda, a mortal queen whose life was irrevocably changed by the god's desires. The myth of Leda and Zeus is not just a tale of divine seduction. It is a story that embodies themes of transformation, divine manipulation, and the delicate intersection between mortal and divine fates. Leda, the beautiful queen of Sparta, was married to King Tyndareus. Together, they ruled over the ancient kingdom with strength and grace, and Leda's beauty was well known throughout the Greek world. Despite her beauty and her position as queen, Leda was not untouched by the meddling of the gods. Zeus, captivated by her allure, sought to make her his own. However, as with many of his affairs, Zeus' pursuit of Leda was not one of straightforward seduction. Instead, it was an affair that unfolded under strange and unsettling circumstances, ultimately altering the lives of Leda and her family in ways they could never have anticipated. The story of Leda and Zeus began when Zeus, desiring the queen, transformed himself into a majestic swan. This transformation was one of Zeus' most famous acts of divine deception, a change in form that allowed him to approach Leda without raising suspicion. The swan, a creature often associated with beauty and grace, was the perfect disguise for Zeus, and it allowed him to approach Leda in a manner that did not immediately reveal his true identity. The transformation into a swan was not simply a random choice for Zeus. It represented both the allure and the danger inherent in his divine powers. In many ways, the swan was a symbol of the seduction that Zeus could exert on those he chose to pursue. Leda, in her innocence, encountered the swan while she was near a river or a pond, depending on the version of the myth. The swan, seemingly harmless, nestled against her for comfort, and in this moment of divine manipulation, Zeus took advantage of Leda's kindness. The swan's appearance was so beautiful and calming that Leda was drawn to it, and in that moment, Zeus, in his swan form, took advantage of her, resulting in an affair between the mortal queen and the transformed god. This act of seduction was not one of mutual affection. It was an act of divine will, carried out by Zeus to fulfill his desires. The result of this union would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Leda, but for the entire world of Greek mythology. From a union between Zeus and Leda, two distinct eggs were laid. In one egg, Leda would give birth to the twin siblings Castor and Pollux, also known as the Dioscuri, who would become two of the most famous figures in Greek mythology. In the other egg, Leda would give birth to Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and Clytemnestra, a figure whose role in the Trojan War would be forever etched in myth. The birth of these children, born of a union between a mortal and a god, would set the stage for a series of events that would reverberate through the ages. The twins, Castor and Pollux, became famed for their extraordinary strength, bravery, and connection to the stars. Castor and Pollux, known as the Gemini, were the sons of Zeus and Leda, though one of the twins was born of Zeus' divine influence, while the other was a result of Leda's marriage to King Tyndareus. This dual nature made the twins unique, and their bond was one of the strongest in all of Greek mythology. They fought in numerous battles, defended their honor, and became symbols of friendship, loyalty, and brotherly love. Their story would become one of legend, their names immortalized in the stars as the constellation Gemini. However, it was the birth of Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, that would have the most profound and tragic impact on the mortal world. Helen's beauty was unparalleled, and it was said that she was the most beautiful woman to ever walk the earth. This beauty would become both a blessing and a curse, as it was her very beauty that would lead to the infamous events of the Trojan War. Helen's abduction by Paris, the Prince of Troy, would spark the 10-year-long war that would consume the Greek world, causing the deaths of countless warriors, heroes, and leaders, including her own husband Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Helen, despite her beauty and her status as the daughter of Zeus, became a pawn in the power struggles of mortals and gods alike, with her actions and her fate ultimately determined by forces far beyond her control. The myth of Leda and Zeus, though centered on a moment of divine seduction, is deeply intertwined with the concept of fate and the consequences of divine intervention in mortal lives. Leda, a mortal queen, became the unwilling participant in a divine scheme, caught between her loyalty to her husband and the overwhelming power of Zeus. Her experience with Zeus was one of manipulation and power, a stark reminder of the gods' ability to shape the lives of mortals according to their whims and desires. But Leda's story is not one of passive submission. She is a figure who, though powerless in the face of Zeus' divine will, is nonetheless a key player in the events that follow. Her legacy, through her children, would change the course of history and determine the fate of entire kingdoms. At the heart of the myth of Leda and Zeus is the notion of divine power and its effect on the mortal world. Zeus, as the king of the gods, wielded immense authority and influence, and he often used this power to shape the lives of mortals to suit his desires. In many ways, Zeus was a god who acted not out of malice, but out of an insatiable need to impose his will on the world, regardless of the consequences. Leda, in this sense, was not just a victim of Zeus' desires, but also a symbol of the way in which the gods exert their control over the lives of mortals. Her story, like that of many other figures in Greek mythology, speaks to the vulnerability of mortals in the face of divine power and the far-reaching consequences that often followed the gods' interventions. The birth of Helen, Castor, and Pollux, and the events that followed, also illustrate the unpredictable nature of fate in Greek mythology. The gods may have controlled the course of mortal lives, but they themselves were not free from the influence of fate. Despite Zeus' godlike power, the consequences of his actions, his affair with Leda, and the birth of her children, would lead to the Trojan War, one of the most destructive conflicts in Greek mythology. This paradox of divine will and fate is a recurring theme throughout Greek myths, where gods and mortals alike are bound by forces they cannot fully understand or control. The myth of Leda and Zeus is ultimately a story of transformation, of mortals becoming entangled in the divine, of the boundaries between gods and mortals becoming blurred, and of the lasting effect of the gods' actions on the mortal world. Leda, a mortal woman, was forever changed by her encounter with Zeus, and her children, born of the union between the divine and the mortal, would go on to play pivotal roles in the fate of entire civilizations. The myth serves as a reminder that the gods, despite their power and grandeur, were not above the whims of fate, and that even their most seemingly innocent actions could have consequences that reverberated through the mortal world. The story of Leda and Zeus, with its themes of seduction, transformation, and the inescapable influence of the divine, is a powerful reminder of the complex relationships between gods and mortals in Greek mythology. It underscores the vulnerability of humans in the face of divine power, while also highlighting capacity for greatness and heroism that can emerge from even the most tragic circumstances. Leda's life, marked by divine intervention and transformation, became a crucial point in the chain of events that shaped the world of God and mortals, and the legacy of her children continues to echo through the annals of myth. Zeus, as the ruler of the gods, was a figure whose very presence shaped the events of both the heavens and the mortal realm. His dominion over thunder, lightning, and the sky was only matched by the many stories of his affairs, many of which resulted in significant consequences for the gods and mortals alike. One of the more peculiar and tragic tales that reveals the complexity of Zeus' character is his relationship with the mortal woman Semele. This myth, marked by divine desire, deception, and fatal consequences, is a prime example of the ways in which Zeus' actions, though seemingly driven by love or lust, often led unintended and tragic outcomes. Semele was a mortal princess, the daughter of King Cadmus and Harmonia, who ruled over Thebes. She was beautiful and graceful, and her life was one of privilege, but it was also one touched by the gods. Like many mortals in Greek mythology, Semele's fate was inexorably tied to divine will, and in her case, it was the irresistible attraction of Zeus that would forever alter her life. Her story began innocently enough, but it quickly spiraled into one of the most tragic and intense myths in the Greek pantheon. Zeus, enamored with Semele, was struck by her beauty and innocence. As he often did with mortal women, he pursued her, and the two soon began a romantic affair. However, unlike many of his other liaisons, Zeus' relationship with Semele would be complicated by both the jealousy of his wife Hera and the inherent dangers of divine powers. The very nature of Zeus being made his affairs perilous for both mortals and gods, for his divine presence was not something that could be easily hidden or contained. Semele, a mortal woman, was caught in the storm of Zeus' desires, and her fate would soon take a dark turn. Hera, Zeus' wife, was well aware of her husband's infidelities, and Semele's beauty had not escaped her notice. As with many of Zeus' lovers, Hera's jealousy knew no bounds. Determined to punish Semele for her affair with Zeus, Hera devised a cruel plan to destroy her. Disguising herself as a nurse, Hera approached Semele and befriended her, gaining her trust. Under the guise of being a sympathetic figure, Hera subtly planted the seeds of doubt and insecurity in Semele's mind. She told Semele that Zeus, being a god, had likely promised her many things, but had never fully revealed his true nature. Hera suggested that Semele ask Zeus to show her his true form, the full glory of his divine power, so that she could prove to herself that he truly loved her. Hera's words, laced with manipulation and malice, planted the idea in Semele's mind that she had been deceived by Zeus. Semele, in her naivety and desperation to be truly loved, took Hera's advice to heart. She demanded that Zeus reveal himself in all his divine glory, his full power and radiance, in front of her. Zeus, though deeply in love with Semele, knew the danger of such a request. His true form, the form of a god, was so powerful that it could destroy anyone who gazed upon it. Nevertheless, Zeus could not deny Semele, and despite his reluctance, he agreed to her request. The consequences of Semele's demand were both swift and catastrophic. When Zeus revealed his true form, he did so with all the might of his divine power, thunder, lightning, and the raw force of the heavens. The sight of such a powerful god in his true form was too much for Semele to bear. She was consumed by the overwhelming intensity of Zeus' presence, and in that instant, her mortal body was unable to withstand the force of his divine power. Semele was struck down by the very god she had sought to embrace. Her body was burned to a crisp by the raw heat and light of Zeus' form, and it seemed as though her life had come to a tragic end. However, the myth of Semele does not end in her death. The gods, though often indifferent to the suffering of mortals, were still deeply connected to the lives of those they touched. As Semele's body lay dying, Zeus, filled with grief and regret for the consequences of his actions, sought to preserve the child she carried in her womb. Semele had been pregnant with Zeus' child, and though she had perished, the child was still alive. In an act of both desperation and hope, Zeus took the unborn child from Semele's charred body and sewed it into his own thigh, keeping the child safe in the only place that could shield it from the world. This act of divine protection was not without precedent in Greek mythology, but it was certainly one of the more peculiar and poignant. Zeus carried the unborn child, protecting it until it was ready to be born. This child, who was later named Dionysus, would grow to become one of the most celebrated and complex gods in Greek mythology. Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and madness, was destined for greatness, but his birth was marked by tragedy, deception, and divine intervention. He was born not from the womb of a mortal woman, but from the thigh of a god, a symbol of his connection to both the mortal and divine worlds. The birth of Dionysus was an event of great significance in Greek mythology. His very existence was a result of Zeus' actions, his desire for Semele, and the divine manipulation of Hera. Dionysus was not merely a child of the gods. He was a bridge between the mortal and immortal realms, embodying both the potential for joy and destruction. His birth was a reminder that the gods, despite their immense power, were not immune to the consequences of their actions, and that the mortal world was often caught in the wake of divine conflict and desire. The consequences of Semele's tragic fate and the birth of Dionysus would continue to echo through Greek mythology. Dionysus, raised by the gods and protected by his father Zeus, would eventually become one of the most influential figures in the pantheon. His ability to cause madness and ecstasy, to bring both destruction and liberation, made him a complex and contradictory god. He was a god of wine, but also of revelry and chaos, and his influence over the mortals was immense. Dionysus' followers, the Maenads, were known for their frenzied worship and ecstatic dances, and they often became consumed by the wild, untamed energy that Dionysus could provoke. His presence in Greek society was marked by both celebration and destruction, and his story reflected the unpredictable and uncontrollable nature of divine power. Dionysus also played a significant role in the story of the Theban king Pentheus, who rejected his divine power. Pentheus, a mortal, refused to acknowledge Dionysus as a god, and as a result, he was driven mad by the god. Dionysus, in his desire to punish Pentheus for his disrespect, caused him to lose his sanity, and Pentheus was ultimately torn apart by the Maenads, his own mother among them. This story, filled with themes of divine vengeance and the consequences of defying the gods, further emphasize the unpredictable nature of Dionysus and the consequences that could arise from crossing the gods. The myth of Semele, Zeus, and Dionysus is a story of divine passion, manipulation, and tragedy. It speaks to the complexities of the gods, their relationships with mortals, and the lasting effects of their desires. Zeus, though a god of immense power, was not immune to the dangers of his actions, and his relationship with Semele demonstrated the unpredictable and often destructive consequences of divine love. Semele's death, while tragic, gave birth to one of the most complex and celebrated gods in Greek mythology, a god whose influence was felt in both the mortal and divine realms. The birth of Dionysus was a reminder that the gods, though powerful and immortal, were not free from the consequences of their actions, and that their desires often set in motion events that would change the course of the world. Dionysus' story, a blend of joy, madness, and divine intervention, reflects the deeper themes that run throughout Greek mythology: the inescapable influence of fate, the unpredictable nature of divine power, and the enduring consequences of the gods' desires. In the end, the myth of Semele and Dionysus is not just a tragic love story, but a reminder of the delicate balance between the gods and mortals, and the price that is often paid when the two worlds collide. Zeus, the king of the gods, whose name resonated across the heavens and earth, was a figure whose power extended far beyond mere control over thunder and lightning. His reign over the gods was marked by many divine liaisons, each of which carried its own complexities and consequences. One of the more tragic and mysterious stories tied to Zeus' romantic affairs involves his pursuit of the Titaness, Mnemosyne. This myth, though not as widely known as some of Zeus' other affairs, holds immense significance, especially in understanding the deep interconnections between memory, wisdom, and divine influence. The affair between Zeus and Mnemosyne, which resulted in the birth of the Muses, highlights themes of knowledge, creativity, and the divine gift of inspiration. Mnemosyne, in Greek mythology, was a personification of memory, a Titaness whose role in the cosmos was fundamental to the order of things. She was one of the primordial beings, a daughter of Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. As the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne was not just a passive figure. She played a pivotal role in preserving the knowledge and experiences of both gods and mortals. Memory, in the ancient world, was regarded as a powerful and essential force, for it was through memory that knowledge was passed down through generations and wisdom was preserved. Despite her great importance, Mnemosyne was not immune to the whims of the gods. Zeus, captivated by her beauty and power, sought to take her as his lover. Unlike many of his other affairs, which were often marked by deception or manipulation, the union between Zeus and Mnemosyne was said to have been more consensual. However, this does not mean that it was devoid of its own complexities. Their meeting, according to the myth, was not born out of passion alone, but rather a deep desire to create something that would have lasting value for both the gods and the world at large. The affair between Zeus and Mnemosyne lasted for 9 consecutive nights. This detail is significant, for it underscores the importance of memory in Greek thought. 9 nights of union represent a span of time that is both focused and expansive, allowing for the creation of something profound. The number 9, in ancient Greek culture, held great symbolic weight, as it was associated with completion and wholeness. Through this extended union, Zeus and Mnemosyne produced the 9 Muses, divine beings whose roles would forever shape the arts, culture, and intellectual pursuits of both gods and mortals. The Muses were goddesses of inspiration, each responsible for a different domain of artistic and intellectual activity. Their names were Calliope, Clio, Erato, Euterpe, Melpomene, Polyhymnia, Terpsichore, Talia, and Urania, and they were often depicted as beautiful young women, surrounded by musical instruments, books, and scrolls, embodying the essence of creativity and wisdom. The Muses were not just muses of the gods, but also for mortals, for it was through their guidance that poets, musicians, historians, and philosophers were able to create works that transcended time. They were seen as the embodiments of divine knowledge, and their influence reached across the realms of music, dance, poetry, and the sciences. While the union between Zeus and Mnemosyne resulted in the birth of the Muses, it also had broader implications for the relationship between memory and creativity. Mnemosyne, as the goddess of memory, represented the link between the past and the present, between experiences lived and knowledge shared. Through the Muses, Memory was not only preserved, but also transformed into something new and eternal. The Muses gave form to the intangible and allowed the divine gift of memory to evolve into the creative expressions that would define culture and civilization. They represented the intersection of memory and inspiration, reminding both gods and mortals that knowledge was not static but dynamic, always capable of giving birth to new forms and ideas. The birth of the Muses, however, was not just a simple tale of divine procreation. It carried with it deeper philosophical and metaphysical implications. In Greek thought, memory was not merely the act of recalling past events, but also the process of shaping the future. Memory, in this sense, was both a foundation and a lens through which the world could be understood and interpreted. The Muses, as the children of Mnemosyne, embodied this dual nature of memory, for they were not simply the guardians of the past, but also the creators of the future. They were, in essence, the divine mediators between the past and the present, between experience and expression. Zeus' relationship with Mnemosyne also highlights the idea that creativity, wisdom, and memory are divine gifts, not just human achievements. In many ways, the Muses were a reflection of Zeus' power and influence over both the gods and mortals. Through his affair with Mnemosyne, Zeus demonstrated that divine love and creativity were inextricably linked. The Muses, born from this union, were symbols of the god's ability to shape the world not only through force and power, but also through more subtle and enduring qualities of wisdom and inspiration. While the union between Zeus and Mnemosyne brought about the creation of the Muses, it also underscores the broader role of the gods in shaping human experience. The gods were not merely figures of power who ruled over mortals. They were intimately connected to the processes of creation, knowledge, and artistic expression. The Muses, as the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, were not just passive beings who inspired great works of art. They were the very conduits through which the gods could communicate with humanity. They were a reminder that divine influence was not always exerted through force or domination, but also through the gentler, more enduring forces of memory, creativity, and inspiration. The legacy of the Muses extended far beyond their birth. Over time, they became central figures in the development of Greek culture. Poets such as Homer invoked the Muses at the beginning of their works, seeking their divine guidance and inspiration. Artists, musicians, and philosophers all turned to the Muses for their creative gifts, believing that true wisdom and artistic excellence could only come through the divine. The Muses were not just patrons of the arts. They were the very source of all creativity, and their influence reached into every aspect of Greek life. The relationship between Zeus and Mnemosyne, though relatively simple in its narrative, reveals profound insights into the Greek understanding of the divine and the human experience. Memory in Greek thought was not just an act of recollection, but a vital force that shaped identity, knowledge, and creativity. The birth of the Muses, the result of Zeus' affair with Mnemosyne, was a reflection of this understanding. The Muses represent the divine potential for human creativity and knowledge, and their influence helped to shape the course of civilization. Through the Muses, Zeus and Mnemosyne gave the world the gift of inspiration, the ability to transcend the limitations of time and space, and to create works that would endure long after their creators had passed. The story of Zeus and Mnemosyne also highlights the delicate balance between the divine and mortal worlds. While Zeus and Mnemosyne were gods, their union had lasting consequences for mortals as well. Through their children, the Muses, mortals were able to tap into the divine wellspring of inspiration and creativity, and in doing so, they connected with the gods on a level that transcended physicality. The Muses, in many ways, were the divine bridge between the mortal and immortal realms, reminding both God and humans that creativity, wisdom, and memory were the forces that bound the two worlds together. In conclusion, the union between Zeus and Mnemosyne and the birth of the Muses is a myth that encapsulates a profound connection between memory, creativity, and the divine. Through their children, the Muses, Zeus and Mnemosyne provided the world with a gift of inspiration, the ability to create works of art and knowledge that would endure through time. The Muses were not just symbols of divine beauty or creativity. They were the very essence of the forces that shaped human existence. Through them, both gods and mortals were reminded that memory and inspiration are not merely human endeavors, but divine gifts that transcend time and space, allowing the past, present, and future to exist in a harmonious flow of creation and expression. The myth of Zeus and Europa is one of the many tales that showcase the complex relationships between gods and mortals in Greek mythology. It is a story that intertwines love, deception, and divine will with consequences that shape the future of both the mortal and immortal worlds. Zeus, as the chief of the Olympian gods, was not unfamiliar with infidelity and romantic pursuits. His many affairs with mortal women were part of his complex character, a god who sought not only to exercise his power over the cosmos, but also to indulge in human desires. The story of Europa, however, stands out as one of the most captivating of his many liaisons, partly due to the dramatic nature of the myth and its far-reaching consequences. Europa was a beautiful Phoenician princess, the daughter of King Agenor Tyre and the sister of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. She was renowned for her beauty, and it was this beauty that caught the attention of Zeus, who, like many of the gods before him, sought to possess her. However, unlike some of his other affairs, Zeus did not approach Europa in his usual form. Instead, he took on a different guise, one that would allow him to seduce her in a manner that would leave her unaware of the divine forces at play. The myth begins with Europa spending time with her attendants by the seashore. While she was there, playing or gathering flowers, Zeus observed her from afar, struck by her radiant beauty. Unable to resist, Zeus decided to take action and began to devise a plan to win her affection. However, instead of simply descending to earth in his usual majestic form, Zeus transformed himself into a magnificent white bull. This transformation was not only an artistic display of his divine power, but also a more subtle method of seduction. The white bull was a creature of grace and strength, symbolizing purity and gentleness, characteristics that made it impossible for Europa to resist. When Europa first saw the bull, she was enchanted by its calm demeanor and beauty. In some versions of the myth, Europa even grew fond of the creature, believing it to be a harmless, beautiful animal. The bull, in turn, slowly approached Europa, who, sensing no danger, began to pet it and eventually climbed onto its back. Zeus, in his bull form, then took the opportunity to carry her away. He leapt into the sea with Europa on his back, and, using his divine power, he swam across the waters to the island of Crete. Europa, initially unaware of the magnitude of what was happening, was swept away by the strength and gentleness of the bull, never suspecting that she was being carried away by none other than Zeus himself. Once they arrived in Crete, Zeus revealed his true identity to Europa. It is said that she was initially shocked and overwhelmed by the revelation, realizing that the divine bull she had admired was in fact the king of the gods. Despite this revelation, the two became lovers, and Europa's life was forever changed. The union between Zeus and Europa was not simply one of love or desire, but rather one that would have lasting consequences for both the mortal world and the divine realm. Europa, who had been abducted by Zeus, would eventually become the queen of Crete, a position that brought her not only power, but also a unique relationship with the gods. Their union was not without its consequences. Europa soon found herself pregnant with Zeus' child, and she would give birth to a son named Minos, who would later become one of the most famous kings of Crete. Minos was destined to rule over a great kingdom, and was known for his wisdom, justice, and connections to the gods. However, the legacy of Europa's relationship with Zeus did not stop there. Europa's descendants would play key roles in many other significant myths and events in Greek mythology, including the story of the Minotaur, the Labyrinth, and the Trojan War. The birth of Minos set in motion a chain of events that would shape the future of the Greek world, and bring about a series of challenges and tragedies. After their time together in Crete, Zeus and Europa's connection continued to resonate through the centuries. Zeus, as always, had many other affairs and many other mortal lovers, but Europa remained one of the most significant. Her story would later be immortalized in art and literature, representing the complexities of divine love and the intricate relationships between gods and mortals. For Europa, however, the effects of her union with Zeus would extend far beyond the birth of Minos. She had been chosen by the gods, and her story would forever be tied to the fate of the Mediterranean world. One of the most significant aspects of the myth of Europa is its connection to the island of Crete. Crete, in Greek mythology, was a land of great importance, both culturally and historically. It was the birthplace of many famous myths, such as the story of the Minotaur and the rise of the Minoan civilization. Crete also played a key role in the larger story of Greek mythology, as it was home to the powerful Minoan kings who were said to have been favored by the gods. The island itself became a symbol of divine intervention, with the gods shaping the fate of its rulers and citizens. Europa's connection to Crete, through her union with Zeus, cemented her place in the annals of Greek myth as a key figure in the island's mythological history. Europa's story also highlights one of the recurring themes in Greek mythology, the power dynamics between gods and mortals. In many of Zeus' liaisons, mortals were often swept away by the overwhelming force of the divine. Europa, like many other women who caught Zeus' eye, was a victim of his desires. Yet, in the case of Europa, she was also a figure who transcended her initial abduction and became a queen in her own right. Her experience with Zeus, while initially marked by abduction and deceit, ultimately led to a legacy of power and influence. Europa's role as a queen of Crete was a reflection of the ways in which gods could elevate mortals, sometimes through means of force or manipulation, but with lasting and significant results. In some versions of the myth, Europa is said to have given birth to other children, including Rhadamanthys and Sarpedon, who were also important figures in Greek mythology. Rhadamanthys became one of the judges of the dead in the underworld, while Sarpedon was a hero who fought and died in the Trojan War. These children, born from Zeus and Europa, further reinforced the idea that the gods' interventions in the lives of mortals had long-lasting effects, rippling through generations and shaping the future of the world. Europa's influence also extended to the realm of art and culture. In ancient Greece, the myth of Europa was a popular subject for artists and poets, who often depicted her abduction by Zeus in various forms of art. The image of the divine bull carrying Europa across the sea became an iconic representation of both divine power and beauty. The myth was a subject of fascination for many, as it encapsulated the complex interplay between the gods and mortals and the consequences of divine love and manipulation. The myth of Europa is one of the many examples of how Zeus' relationships with mortals were often marked by both beauty and tragedy. While Europa's life was forever changed by her encounter with Zeus, she became a significant figure in her own right. Her children, her rule over Crete, and her legacy as a queen of divine descent all played important roles in the development of Greek mythology. The myth of Europa is also a reminder of the power and influence of the gods, and how their desires could shape the course of history, often in ways that were unexpected and far-reaching. In conclusion, the story of Zeus and Europa is a powerful reminder of the ways in which the gods shaped the lives of mortals. While the myth is centered on Zeus' desire and manipulation, it also shows how mortals, even when caught in the grip of divine forces, could rise to positions of great power and influence. Europa's life was marked by her connection to Zeus, but it was also marked by her own agency and her eventual role as a queen of Crete. Her story, woven into the fabric of Greek mythology, continues to resonate as a tale of love, transformation, and the enduring impact of the gods on the mortal world. The myth of Zeus and the mortal woman Io is one of the many tales in Greek mythology that explores the powerful and often troubling dynamics between gods and mortals. This myth, like many others involving Zeus, is filled with themes of desire, transformation, and the struggle between human vulnerability and divine power. The story of Io, a beautiful priestess of Hera, is a tragic one that ultimately reveals the consequences of divine manipulation and the lengths to which Zeus would go to pursue his desires. Io was a mortal woman, the daughter of Inachus, the river god, and a respected priestess of the goddess Hera on Argos. Her beauty was renowned, and it was this beauty that caught the eye of Zeus. As with many of his other romantic entanglements, Zeus' desire for Io was immediate and intense. However, Io's status as a priestess of Hera made her a figure that was particularly sacred and protected, and as such, Zeus knew that pursuing her would bring complications and provoke the wrath of his wife, Hera. Nonetheless, Zeus' desires were often unstoppable, and he sought to possess Io, despite the consequences. In some versions of myth, Zeus' pursuit of Io began innocently enough, as he first admired her from afar. However, as was often the case with Zeus, his passion soon overwhelmed his ability to remain discreet. Determined to have Io, Zeus descended to the mortal world, appearing before her in the guise of a cloud or mist. In this ethereal form, Zeus approached Io, attempting to conceal his true identity while still pursuing his desires. Io, unaware of the true nature of the cloud, was initially charmed by its gentle, protective presence, which provided her with a sense of security. Yet, As with many of Zeus' liaisons, things quickly escalated. When Hera, Zeus' wife, discovered that her husband had been pursuing Io, she became furious. The jealousy and rage that Hera felt toward Zeus' many lovers was legendary, and her wrath was not easily quelled. Hera, ever vigilant, knew that Zeus' actions had to be punished, and she resolved to take drastic measures. In some versions of myth, Hera caught Zeus in the act with Io, while in others Zeus, aware of Hera's watchful eye, quickly transformed Io into a cow in order to hide his affair. This transformation was one of Zeus' most drastic and significant acts of divine intervention, and it marked the beginning of Io's tragic journey. Zeus, in an attempt to protect Io from Hera's fury, turned her into a beautiful white cow. However, this transformation did not shield her from Hera's anger. Hera, enraged by Zeus' continued infidelity, demanded the cow as a gift, and Zeus, unable to refuse his wife, reluctantly handed Io over to her. Hera, in her jealousy and fury, then ordered the cow to be bound and placed under the watchful gaze of Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, who was known for his ability to see everything. Argus, as eternal watcher, was tasked with guarding Io and ensuring that she could not escape. Io, now trapped in her cow form and under constant surveillance, faced a life of misery, unable to return to her human existence and unable to find any hope of escape. Yet even in the face of such an oppressive fate, there was still hope for Io. Zeus, unwilling to let her suffer in her transformed state, sent his messenger Hermes to free her. Hermes, the god of communication and trickery, was known for his cunning and ability to move swiftly, and he was sent by Zeus to put an end to Argus' watch over Io. In one of the most famous moments in the myth, Hermes approached Argus while he was watching over Io. To lull Argus to sleep, Hermes played his magic flute, soothing the giant into a deep, dreamless slumber. Once Argus had closed all his eyes in sleep, Hermes struck him down, ending the giant's vigil and allowing Io to escape her captivity. Io, still in the form of a cow, continued her journey in search of freedom. After Argus' death, Hera, in her relentless pursuit of vengeance, sent a gadfly to torment Io, further driving her to madness. The gadfly stung Io incessantly, causing her to wander aimlessly across the earth, unable to find peace or solace. Her journey took her distant lands, from Greece to Egypt, and through this painful and disorienting path, Io experienced not only physical suffering, but also the emotional and psychological toll of her transformation. She was being caught between two worlds, unable to reclaim her humanity, but also constantly pursued by the wrath of Hera. Despite the endless torment she faced, Io's journey ultimately led to her redemption and transformation. After enduring the maddening stings of the gadfly and wandering through various lands, she eventually found herself in Egypt, where her fate would take a dramatic turn. There, Io was finally freed from her torment, and her transformation was reversed. In some versions of the myth, she regained her human form and was purified of the curse that had plagued her. It is said that Io eventually became an ancestor of the royal house of Egypt, and that her descendants included some of the greatest figures in Egyptian mythology and history. In this way, Io's legacy was secured, and her suffering ultimately led to her position of power and honor in the distant land of Egypt. The myth of Io is one of the many tragic stories that populate Greek mythology, but also serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of divine love, jealousy, and the consequences of human desires. Zeus, though the ruler of the gods and the most powerful being in the universe, was not immune to the consequences of his actions. His pursuit of Io, though driven by desire, resulted in an intense and tragic journey for both the mortal woman and the divine world. Hera's wrath, while often viewed as a vengeful response to Zeus' infidelities, is also a reflection of the deep emotional complexity and human qualities that gods are believed to possess in Greek mythology. Through Io's transformation, her torment, and her eventual redemption, the myth also touches on themes of suffering, resilience, and the possibility of change. Io, though a victim of Zeus and Hera's conflict, ultimately finds a way to transcend her suffering and regain her humanity, though it is only through immense pain and hardship. Her story is one of survival and endurance, and it speaks to the human experience of overcoming insurmountable odds, even when the forces at play seem beyond one's control. It is also a tale of divine intervention, where gods and goddesses shape the lives of mortals, often through painful and destructive means, but sometimes in ways that ultimately lead to growth and transformation. Io's story is also a reminder of the ways in which Greek mythology often framed the relationship between gods and mortals as one of power and control. Gods, with their ability to shape the world, could both uplift and destroy mortals at will. The lives of mortals were often at the mercy of divine whims, and their suffering or success was determined by the capricious nature of the gods. In Io's case, her transformation and torment were direct results of Zeus' affair and Hera's jealousy. She was caught in a struggle between two gods, neither of whom fully considered the cost of their actions on her life. In a broader sense, the myth of Io also speaks to the idea of the world being a place where the divine and the mortal are constantly intertwined, often in ways that lead to chaos and tragedy. Io's journey, from her abduction to her transformation and eventual redemption, is a metaphor for the mortal condition itself, caught between the forces of fate, divine will, and the quest for freedom and self-realization. Her suffering is a reflection of the suffering that many mortals face in a world governed by gods who, though powerful and immortal, are not above jealousy, vengeance, and desire. In conclusion, the myth of Zeus and Io is a tale of divine desire, power, and suffering. It is a story that reveals the complexities of the gods and the way in which their actions shape the lives of mortals. Io's journey, marked by her transformation into a cow, her torment by Hera, and her eventual redemption in Egypt, is one of the most tragic and poignant myths in Greek mythology. It is a story of power, control, and the enduring struggle for freedom, and it continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the fragility of mortal existence in the face of divine will. The myth of Zeus and Leda is one of the most intricate and complex stories within Greek mythology, as it explores themes of transformation, deception, and the consequences of divine manipulation. Zeus, always entangled in love affairs, often pursued mortal women with the irresistible force of storm. However, in the case of Leda, the beauty and mystery of the myth lie in the nature of his pursuit, the form he took, and the consequences of their union. Zeus' relationship with Leda ultimately resulted in one of the most famous and significant moments in Greek mythology, the birth of Helen of Troy, whose beauty would later lead to the Trojan War. Leda was a queen, the wife of King Tyndareus of Sparta, and a woman of extraordinary beauty. Her marriage was a peaceful and prosperous one, though little did she know that the fates of both gods and mortals were about to intertwine in her life. Zeus, who had a history of seducing mortal women, was struck by Leda's beauty and, as was often the case with Zeus, he desired her. However, this particular union would not follow the typical narrative of Zeus descending to earth in his true form, an awe-inspiring god who captivated women with his divine presence. Instead, Zeus employed one of his most famous disguises, a swan. The myth begins with Zeus observing Leda as she was either walking by a river or taking a moment of rest in her palace. Whether alone or with her attendants, Leda's beauty captured the attention of Zeus, who, unlike other instances where he might have appeared as a king or a god, transformed into a magnificent swan. His choice of this form was significant. Swans were often associated with love and beauty in Greek symbolism, and in this instance, Zeus' transformation allowed him to approach Leda without alarming her, presenting himself as a creature of grace and innocence rather than one of overwhelming power. Leda, unaware that the swan was, in fact, the king of the gods, found herself drawn to the bird. The swan, taking advantage of her compassion and curiosity, flew close to Leda, perhaps even landing beside her. Zeus, in his swan form, approached her with an irresistible charm. As with many of Zeus' amorous pursuits, he managed to charm his victims, coaxing them into intimacy under the guise of affection. In the myth, it is not entirely clear whether Leda willingly consorted with the swan or whether she was, in some ways, taken advantage of by the divine creature. What is certain is that this act of divine seduction would have lasting consequences that would echo throughout history. After their union, Leda's fate was forever altered. She soon discovered that she was pregnant, and the question of who the father of her children was lingered in the air. In some versions of myth, it is said that she bore two sets of twins. One set of twins, Castor and Pollux, were the children of Tyndareus, her mortal husband, while the other set, Helen and Clytemnestra, were the children of Zeus. Leda's miraculous conception, and the subsequent births of these children served to intertwine the lives of mortals and gods with powerful and long-lasting consequences. Helen, who would go on to become one of the most famous women in history, was the product of Zeus' divine seduction. Known as the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen's beauty would be the catalyst for one of the most infamous events in Greek mythology, the Trojan War. Her abduction by Paris, the Prince of Troy, would spark a conflict that would lead to the destruction of Troy itself and result in the deaths of countless heroes and warriors. Helen's birth, stemming from a union of a mortal queen and the king of the gods, reflects the intertwining of divine and mortal realms and the often disastrous consequences of their intersection. The other twin, Clytemnestra, would also play a critical role in the Greek mythological narrative. She became the wife of Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces during the Trojan War. However, Clytemnestra's story is far darker than that of her sister Helen. Clytemnestra's eventual murder of her husband, Agamemnon, upon his return from Troy, would set off a chain of tragic events that will reverberate through the generations. Clytemnestra's actions are marked by betrayal, revenge, and a profound sense of injustice, and her story serves as a reminder of the complex and often violent consequences of divine intervention in mortal affairs. Castor and Pollux, the twin brothers, also had a significant place in Greek mythology. Known as the Dioscuri, or sons of Zeus, they were revered as protectors of sailors and as symbols of brotherly loyalty. Castor and Pollux were inseparable throughout their lives, and their bond was so strong that even in death, they were granted immortality by Zeus, who allowed them to live on as the constellation Gemini. The twins' heroic deeds and their eventual transformation into stars reflect the heroic ideals of the Greeks, emphasizing bravery, loyalty, and the bond between brothers. While the children of Leda and Zeus were all born from the same union, their destinies diverged in fascinating ways. Helen's beauty would lead to the Trojan War, and her role in this conflict would become the subject of countless stories, poems, and tragedies. Clytemnestra's tragic actions would echo through generations, as her story of vengeance and betrayal would inspire many works of literature and drama. Castor and Pollux, in contrast, embodied the virtues of heroism and brotherhood, and their legacy would be celebrated for centuries as the epitome of heroic ideals. The myth of Zeus and Leda, however, is not just about the children who were born from this union, but also about the powerful dynamics of divine and mortal relationships. The story highlights the ways in which the gods, especially Zeus, wield their power over mortals, often with little regard for the long-term consequences of their actions. Zeus, in his pursuit of Leda, took on the form of a swan, masking his true nature to seduce her. This act of deception is a recurring theme in Zeus' many affairs, where he often uses trickery and disguise to achieve his desires. While the gods were often depicted as beings of great power and wisdom, they were also capable of immense selfishness and disregard for the welfare of mortals. The myth also underscores the role of fate in Greek mythology. Leda's encounter with Zeus was not a mere accident. It was a divine intervention that was part of a larger cosmic plan. The children born from her union with Zeus were not just ordinary children. They were the products of divine influence, and their fates were intertwined with the broader course of Greek history. Helen's beauty and her role in the Trojan War were predestined, and the consequences of her actions would lead to the fall of Troy and the deaths of many heroes. Clytemnestra's murder of her husband, Agamemnon, was another consequence of the divine machinations that began with Zeus' seduction of Leda. In this sense, the myth of Zeus and Leda is a reflection of the Greek belief in fate, the idea that the gods, through their actions and manipulations, shaped the destinies of mortals in ways that could not be avoided. The legacy of Leda's children, especially Helen, Castor, and Pollux, also highlights the enduring influence of divine bloodlines in Greek mythology. The children of Zeus were often portrayed as heroes or figures of great importance, and their actions and fates had lasting consequences for the mortal world. The story of Leda's union with Zeus is not just a tale of passion or desire. It is a story that speaks of the profound impact that the gods had on the mortal world and the inextricable link between the divine and the human. The children born from Zeus' affairs were often seen as both blessed and cursed, blessed with divine lineage and strength, but cursed by the weight of their gods' actions. In conclusion, the myth of Zeus and Leda is a tale that touches on themes of love, deception, fate, and divine power. Zeus' seduction of Leda, disguised as a swan, resulted in the birth of some of the most significant figures in Greek mythology. Helen's beauty would lead to the Trojan War. Clytemnestra's revenge would alter the course of Greek history, and Castor and Pollux would become eternal symbols of brotherhood and heroism. The story of Leda's union with Zeus highlights the complexities of divine and mortal relationships, the power of fate, and the ways in which the gods shape the lives of mortals. It is a myth that speaks of the ways in which love, power, and destiny can intertwine, leading to both the creation of heroes and the destruction of empires. The story of Zeus and Semele is one of the more tragic tales within the rich tapestry of Greek mythology, steeped in themes of love, desire, jealousy, and divine wrath. It is a narrative that also explores the dangerous and often destructive consequences of interacting with the gods, especially for mortals who are caught in the god schemes. Zeus, ever entangled in affairs with mortals, had many lovers, each of whom experienced both the ecstasy and torment of divine love. Semele, a mortal princess and the daughter of King Cadmus and Harmony of Thebes, became one of Zeus' lovers, and her story would unfold as one of the most poignant and devastating of all the mortal relationships Zeus had. Semele was known for her beauty and purity, and she was highly regarded in her kingdom of Thebes. As the daughter of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, Semele was of royal lineage and had a position of high status among mortals. However, despite her noble birth, she had little knowledge of the ways in which the gods interacted with the human world. It was her beauty and innocence that caught the eye of Zeus, who, like many of his previous lovers, was irresistibly drawn to her. But the relationship between Semele and Zeus would not be like the others, for it would be marred by tragedy and fatal consequences. The story begins when Zeus, in his usual manner, descended from Mount Olympus to the mortal realm, drawn to Semele by an overwhelming desire for her. In some versions of the myth, Semele had already been acquainted with the gods and had been a devoted worshipper of Zeus, which made her particularly vulnerable to his advances. In other versions, Zeus simply appeared to her as a god, and their union was one of divine seduction. In either case, their affair was passionate and intense, and Semele, like many before her, was swept away by the charm and allure of Zeus. As is often the case with Zeus and his mortal lovers, the relationship between Semele and the king of the gods was not destined to remain a secret for long. Eventually, Hera, Zeus' wife, learned of the affair. Hera, whose jealousy and anger were legendary, could not tolerate the infidelity of her husband, especially when it involved one of his many mortal lovers. Hera's reaction was not to confront Zeus directly, but rather to punish Semele, the unsuspecting mortal who had caught Zeus' attention. Hera's jealousy and wrath are central to the unfolding of Semele's tragic fate. Disguised as an old woman, Hera visited Semele and began to sow seeds of doubt in her mind. Pretending to be a concerned friend, Hera encouraged Semele to ask Zeus to reveal his true form to her. Hera knew that the mortal Semele, in her mortal frailty, could not possibly withstand the full radiance and power of Zeus in his true divine form. She manipulated Semele into believing that, as a lover of a god, she was entitled to see Zeus as he truly was. Hera's cunning worked, and Semele, trusting the old woman, agreed to make this dangerous request. Semele, under Hera's influence, sent word to Zeus asking him to reveal himself in all his divine glory. Zeus, though knowing the consequences of such an action, could not refuse the request of his lover. He had long been accustomed to granting the wishes of his mortal lovers, and in this case, his love for Semele, combined with his desire to keep their affair secret no longer, led him to make a fateful decision. Zeus agreed to Semele's request, but he cautioned her that she would not be able to survive the sight of him in his full glory. But Semele, driven by a desire to prove her love for Zeus and perhaps to bask in the ultimate divine experience, insisted. She wanted to see her lover, the god she adored, in his true magnificent form. Zeus, unable to refuse her, revealed himself as he was, shining with the full force of divine power, his radiant presence overwhelming and awe-inspiring. The moment Zeus appeared in his godly form, the earth itself seemed to tremble with his divine energy. But Semele, mortal and frail, could not withstand the intensity of Zeus' power. The sight of him in his full glory was too much for her to bear. Her body was consumed by the blinding radiance, and she was struck down by the sheer force of Zeus' divine presence. Her life, tragically, came to a sudden and violent end. However, Semele's story did not end with her death. In one of the most remarkable and redemptive aspects of this myth, Zeus, in his grief over her death, managed to save their unborn child. Semele had been pregnant with Zeus' child at the time of her death, and this child, though she perished, was destined for greatness. Zeus, unwilling to let the child die along with Semele, took the fetus from her womb and sewed it into his own thigh. This unusual act of divine intervention, though strange and symbolic, allowed the child to survive and eventually be born. This child was none other than Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. Dionysus' birth from Zeus' thigh was a moment of profound significance in Greek mythology. Dionysus would go on to become one of the most important gods in the Greek pantheon, representing both the liberating and destructive forces of nature. His power, rooted in the wild and untamed aspects of existence, mirrored the tragic and complex nature of his origins. Dionysus would be known for his ability to inspire madness, intoxication, and ecstasy, but also for his destructive wrath and vengeful nature. His life and myths were filled with both celebration and catastrophe, and his connection to his mother, Semele, would forever remain a poignant reminder of the fragility of mortal existence in the face of divine power. In the aftermath of Semele's death, Zeus honored her memory by ensuring that her son, Dionysus, would be recognized as one of the 12 Olympian gods. Dionysus would grow up to challenge the very structure of the gods and bring about radical shifts in Greek society, especially in terms of religious rituals. The cult of Dionysus, which centered around ecstatic worship, the consumption of wine, and the breaking of societal norms, would spread across Greece and play a key role in the religious and cultural landscape of the ancient world. Through his mother's death and his extraordinary birth, Dionysus would bring a unique form of divine influence to both mortals and gods. Semele's story, as tragic as it is, also reflects deeper themes of the vulnerability of mortals when dealing with the gods. The gods in Greek mythology, though powerful and immortal, were often capricious and indifferent to the lives of mortals. Zeus' love for Semele, though genuine, was ultimately overshadowed by his inability to protect her from the destructive forces of his own power. Hera's jealousy and manipulation served as a powerful reminder of the complex and often dangerous dynamics between the gods, and how the desires of one god could lead to the suffering or death of others. Semele's tragic fate also speaks to the ancient Greek understanding of divine justice and the balance between mortal desires and divine will. In many ways, Semele's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mortal pride and the consequences of overstepping one's bounds. Semele, in her desire to see Zeus in his full glory, unknowingly brought about her own destruction. She sought to experience the divine, but in doing so, she was consumed by it. The gods, while capable of immense love and power, were also forces that mortals could not fully comprehend or control. Semele's request, though driven by her love for Zeus, ultimately led to her undoing. And yet, in the grand arc of the myth, there is a sense of redemption, not just for Zeus, but for Semele herself. Through her tragic death, she gave birth to Dionysus, who would go on to be a central figure in Greek mythology. Dionysus, in many ways, carried his mother's legacy, both in his divine nature and in his connection to the world of mortals. The god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy would forever be linked to the mortal realm, embodying the tensions between the divine and the human and between life and death. Semele's sacrifice, in a sense, paved the way for Dionysus' rise to power, and in that, her tragic end gave birth to something profound and lasting. In conclusion, the myth of Zeus and Semele is a story of love, jealousy, divine intervention, and tragedy. It highlights the dangers of interacting with the gods and the often tragic consequences of seeking the divine too eagerly. Zeus' love for Semele, tempered by the manipulation of Hera, ultimately led to the destruction of Semele, but also to the birth of one of the most powerful and influential gods in Greek mythology, Dionysus. Through this tragic story, the Greeks explored themes of divine power, human vulnerability, and the complexity of the relationships between gods and mortals.